There is a misunderstanding we often carry about betrayal. We assume that the one who betrays walks away untouched, relieved, even victorious. But that assumption comes from looking only at behavior, not at the inner world that drives it. When a deeply empathic person is betrayed, the pain is visible, raw, and immediate. When the betrayer lacks empathy, the damage is quieter, buried, and far more enduring. A super empath doesn't just love, they see. They feel what others avoid feeling. Their presence gently invites truth, vulnerability, and emotional responsibility. And for someone who has spent a lifetime surviving by disconnecting from their own pain, that kind of presence is not comforting. It is terrifying. Because empathy doesn't attack, it reflects. It holds up a mirror that says without words, "This is who you are when no one is watching." When betrayal happens, it isn't simply the breaking of trust. It is an act of self-protection by someone who cannot tolerate being truly known. In that moment, the empath becomes a reminder of everything unfinished inside the betrayer: unfelt grief, unmet childhood needs, shame that was never metabolized, and a self that was never allowed to develop safely. The empath's integrity becomes unbearable because it highlights the absence of one's own. When we speak of betrayal, we often imagine a simple transaction: trust is broken, feelings are hurt, a relationship is damaged. But beneath this surface is something far more profound, something that reaches into the very architecture of the human psyche. When a narcissist betrays a super empath, it is not merely an act aimed at another person. It is an act that inadvertently exposes the deepest fractures within themselves. This is a point that is easily overlooked, because we tend to measure the consequences of betrayal in terms of external suffering. We see the super empath's heartbreak, their confusion, the destabilization of their world, and we forget to look at the internal experience of the one who betrayed. And yet, this internal experience, though hidden, is far more telling, far more consequential, and far more devastating in the long term. For a narcissist, betrayal is not just about breaking trust. It is about encountering the unbearable truth of a self that has been deeply wounded, a self that has not been seen, nurtured, or allowed to feel from the earliest moments of life. The concept of childhood wounds is central here. A person who grows up without consistent validation, without attunement to their emotions, without the gentle containment of someone who says, "I see you, I feel you, you are safe," carries a profound absence. That absence does not vanish with age. It remains as a silent, unacknowledged companion. It shapes how they relate to others, how they seek love, how they manage discomfort. In the narcissist, this absence manifests as a protective armor, a set of strategies designed to obscure vulnerability and project a sense of control, competence, and self-sufficiency. On the surface, they may appear confident, even dominant, but beneath this veneer is a fragile, unintegrated self. Every act of betrayal, every attempt to manipulate or control another person, is a desperate effort to avoid feeling the raw, unmet needs that persist from childhood. It is not merely a moral failing. It is a survival mechanism honed over decades, a learned response to the profound experience of being invisible, unheard, or unsafe as a child. When a super empath enters the life of someone like this, they bring with them a quality that the narcissist cannot easily tolerate. A super empath does not merely respond to external stimuli. They perceive the unspoken, the subtle, the unarticulated. They sense the pain behind the bravado, the longing beneath the mask of indifference, the fear hidden in moments of control or aggression. Their very presence acts like a mirror, reflecting not just who the narcissist wants to be seen as, but who they truly are. This reflection is dangerous for someone who has built a lifetime of defenses because it bypasses manipulation, charm, or denial and confronts them with the unprocessed reality of their inner life. The betrayal, then, is not just a rejection of the empath. It is an unconscious attempt to remove that reflection, to escape the uncomfortable awareness of unresolved wounds that have never been addressed, that have never been nurtured, and that have never been allowed to exist in safe, conscious space. There is a paradox here that is difficult for outsiders to grasp. The narcissist may believe that they are acting out of freedom, choice, or even necessity, but in reality, they are acting out of fear. The fear is not of consequences from the world. It is the fear of facing themselves. Each moment with the super empath is a potential confrontation with the child they once were, the child who was unseen, unvalidated, and unheld. Every betrayal is an attempt to avoid that confrontation. And yet, avoidance does not erase the wound, it magnifies it. The unacknowledged childhood pain does not stay silent. It festers, creating a growing internal chaos that is often projected onto the outside world, onto the empath, or onto anyone who dares to show authenticity. The deeper the wound, the more the projection, and the more intense the cycle of betrayal and emotional disconnection becomes. To understand this fully, it is necessary to see betrayal not as a singular event, but as a signal, a symptom of inner turmoil. For the narcissist, the act of betrayal triggers an internal collapse because it mirrors the very childhood experiences that have been buried or denied. There is a fleeting confrontation with vulnerability, a glimpse of helplessness, a recognition of unmet emotional needs, and the inability to integrate this awareness safely. Because the skills to process, regulate, and heal these experiences were never developed, the narcissist experiences the exposure as a threat. Their default is to deflect, to justify, to rationalize, or to suppress. In other words, every betrayal carries with it a silent, invisible cost that is internal, painful, and unrelenting. The mirror of the super empath cannot be avoided. It will always reflect back that unresolved inner landscape, whether the narcissist acknowledges it or not. What is especially compelling and tragic is that this exposure is not necessarily conscious. The narcissist may genuinely believe they are acting freely, choosing selfishly, or asserting independence. They may feel a sense of power or relief in the short term. But beneath this sense of agency is an enduring, subtle, corrosive reminder the wounds of childhood remain unhealed, unacknowledged, and active. The mirror provided by the super empath does not lie, and it does not flinch. It demands recognition, whether the narcissist is willing or prepared. And the more they betray, the more they distance themselves from the mirror, the more fragmented and disconnected they become from the self needs care, attention, and compassion the most. Betrayal, therefore, is simultaneously destructive and revealing. It destroys relationships, trust, and connection, but it also reveals the unhealed interior. The narcissist cannot recover from this exposure easily because their coping mechanisms, honed in childhood, are designed to avoid the very truths that the super empath illuminates. The act of betrayal becomes both a symptom and a perpetuator of their unresolved trauma. Healing would require facing those wounds directly, without distraction, without justification, without control. But such a confrontation is profoundly terrifying for someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding the inner pain they cannot yet metabolize. And so the mirror remains, the reflection remains, and the internal fracture deepens, quietly, relentlessly. Empathy is often celebrated as a gift, a quality that allows us to connect with others, to feel alongside them, and to respond to the world with understanding. Yet, for someone whose sense of self has been fractured, whose early experiences were marked by neglect, dismissal, or emotional inconsistency, empathy is not experienced as a gift. It is experienced as a threat. The reason is subtle, profound, and rooted in the way the human psyche develops. When a child grows up in an environment where their emotions are not mirrored, where their needs are ignored or punished, they must construct a protective self. This self is not authentic, it is a survival mechanism. It learns to mask vulnerability, to suppress longing, and to maintain an illusion of control. Over time, this constructed self becomes the dominant interface with the world because the original raw and feeling self is too painful to inhabit openly. To meet this child self with compassion or even gentle recognition is terrifying because it threatens the stability of the persona that has been holding them together for decades. Empathy from another person does exactly that. It pierces the armor. When a super empath enters the life of someone with a fractured self, they are not simply showing care or concern. They are modeling what it feels like to be fully present, to be fully seen, and to be fully acknowledged. The empath's gaze, attention, and emotional attunement reflect not just the person they are connecting with, but the part of that person that has been denied, rejected, or invalidated since childhood. This reflection is uncomfortable because it is unfamiliar. It is not something the fractured self has practiced managing, and it bypasses the learned strategies of control, manipulation, or emotional suppression. The narcissist experiences this as a threat because it forces a confrontation with aspects of themselves that they have spent a lifetime avoiding. Empathy, in essence, becomes a mirror that refuses to lie, a quiet but undeniable force that challenges their habitual defenses. The threat of empathy is amplified because it is relational. Unlike judgment, criticism, or punishment, empathy is non-coercive. It does not demand, it does not control. It simply holds space for the truth of another's experience. For a fractured self, truth is dangerous. Truth requires recognition, acknowledgement, and acceptance of what has been long denied. It requires sitting with discomfort, feeling the unmet needs that have been pushed aside, and confronting the shame that was never metabolized. The fractured self interprets this not as support, but as exposure, vulnerability, and potential annihilation. In other words, empathy is threatening precisely because it bypasses manipulation and compulsion, and it operates in the realm of authenticity, the very realm the fractured self has learned to avoid. There is also a neurobiological component to consider. Early trauma and neglect alter the nervous system, creating heightened vigilance, hyperarousal, or emotional shutdown in response to perceived threat. When empathy is offered, the nervous system of a person with a fractured self may misread it as danger. The gentle attentiveness of the super empath can trigger defensive mechanisms that were originally designed to protect against abuse or neglect. This is not a conscious choice, it is a survival response. The body and mind are wired to respond to closeness with anxiety, suspicion, or discomfort because, historically, emotional openness has been met with inconsistency or harm. Thus, the very thing that could facilitate connection, the empathic presence, is experienced as destabilizing, and the person reacts by withdrawing, controlling, or betraying if they consciously desire connection. The threat of empathy is further compounded by the narcissist's relationship to shame. Shame is an internalized sense of inadequacy, unworthiness, or fundamental defectiveness. A fractured self often carries shame so deeply that it becomes the lens through which every interaction is filtered. When a super empath responds with care, attunement, or understanding, it implicitly exposes the gap between the self the narcissist presents and the self they hide. This exposure activates shame, which is intensely uncomfortable and often intolerable. In response, the narcissist may act defensively, lashing out, betraying, or avoiding, because engaging with shame directly would require confronting a lifetime of pain, unmet needs, and unhealed wounds. Empathy threatens the protective structures built around shame, and the fractured self interprets this threat as existential. If I am fully seen, I might not survive. This dynamic also explains why repeated betrayals often occur. The narcissist does not simply reject empathy once. They repeatedly push away, manipulate, or betray because the very quality that could heal them also terrifies them. Every act of betrayal is a defense against the discomfort that comes from being seen and feeling deeply. It is a paradoxical cycle. The fractured self craves connection, longs to be seen, and yet reacts destructively to anyone who offers authentic understanding. The super empath's presence triggers both desire and fear, intimacy and terror. The fractured self is trapped between two imperatives: to seek connection and to protect itself from the exposure that empathy brings. This is why recovery is difficult. The narcissist cannot simply change behavior. They must first tolerate and integrate what they have long avoided. And this is a process that is painful, slow, and deeply threatening. Understanding this dynamic also reframes our judgment of betrayal. It is easy to see only the external harm and label the narcissist as cruel, callous, or unfeeling. But this judgment overlooks the inner reality of someone whose early wounds have never been met, whose self has been fractured by neglect or trauma, and whose nervous system interprets genuine empathy as danger. The threat they experience is real, and it is profound, even if it is expressed in harmful ways. Recognizing the terror that empathy provokes in a fractured self allows us to see betrayal not merely as moral failure, but as a symptom of unresolved trauma, unintegrated shame, and a nervous system wired to protect at all costs. When we examine the behavior of someone who has betrayed a deeply empathic individual, it is crucial to distinguish between genuine remorse and the collapse induced by shame, because these two experiences are profoundly different in their origins, their manifestations, and their consequences. Remorse is a conscious, deliberate recognition of harm done, accompanied by a desire to take responsibility, repair the damage, and learn from the experience. It requires self-awareness, courage, and the capacity to sit with one's own discomfort without displacing it onto others. Shame-driven collapse, by contrast, is a reaction rooted not in awareness or accountability, but in fear, self-loathing, and avoidance. It is a defensive unraveling of the self, an internal chaos as triggered, and the fractured aspects of the personality encounter the reflection of what has been done wrong. For a narcissist, especially one who has betrayed a super empath, the distinction between these two emotional experiences is critical to understanding why recovery is so often impossible. When a person experiences true remorse, there is a willingness to face the consequences of their actions without needing to justify, rationalize, or manipulate. There is a capacity to acknowledge the pain inflicted, to empathize with the one harmed, and to confront the ways in which their own unresolved wounds contributed to the behavior. Remorse is inherently relational and reflective. It bridges the gap between self and other. It involves insight into the dynamics that led to betrayal, recognition of personal responsibility, and a genuine desire to prevent recurrence. This requires emotional literacy, self-regulation, and a sense of moral integrity, all of which are underdeveloped in someone whose early life required adaptation to neglect, abandonment, or emotional inconsistency. In other words, remorse demands an intact and integrated self, capable of holding discomfort and vulnerability without collapsing or lashing out. Shame-driven collapse, in contrast, is less about responsibility and more about survival. When a narcissist betrays a super empath, the empath's presence inevitably exposes the gaps, deficiencies, and wounds that have been carefully buried and denied. The empath, through their attunement and authenticity, holds up a mirror that reflects not only the harm done, but also the inner reality that has been avoided for decades. For someone with a fractured self, this reflection is intolerable. It triggers an overwhelming sense of exposure, unworthiness, and fear, activating a cascade of shame that the person cannot regulate. Unlike remorse, which engages insight and reflection, shame-driven collapse induces defensiveness, withdrawal, or projection. It is not motivated by the desire to heal or repair, but by the need to escape the unbearable internal pressure of being seen too clearly. The individual may feel a fleeting desire to apologize or correct their actions, but this impulse is not rooted in understanding. It is rooted in self-preservation. One of the ways shame-driven collapse manifests is through what appears externally as self-punishment or self-directed anxiety. The narcissist may obsess over the consequences of their betrayal, ruminate on imagined judgments, or engage in self-sabotaging behaviors that mimic remorse but lack genuine accountability. They may perform apologies that are conditional, deflect responsibility, or attempt to manipulate the narrative in ways that alleviate internal tension without addressing the harm done. This is fundamentally different from remorse, because the focus is not on understanding and repairing the relational harm, but on managing the emotional chaos within themselves. The super empath, attuned to authenticity, can sense the difference immediately. They recognize that the expression is not grounded in understanding or connection, but in a reflexive attempt to contain shame and protect a fractured self. The distinction between remorse and shame-driven collapse also illuminates why recovery for the narcissist is so limited. Remorse is transformative because it requires integration of the self, reflection on unmet needs, and the willingness to develop capacities that were never nurtured in childhood. It engages growth, insight, and relational repair. Shame-driven collapse, by contrast, reinforces fragmentation. The more the narcissist encounters authentic empathy, the more they experience exposure, the more shame accumulates, and the more defensive behaviors are triggered. The cycle becomes self-perpetuating. The person is drawn toward connection, feels the threat of authenticity, collapses under shame, and reacts with betrayal or avoidance. Without intervention that addresses the underlying wounds, this cycle repeats indefinitely. Furthermore, the interplay of shame and empathy creates a paradoxical dynamic. The super empath's very presence, which might catalyze healing for someone open to growth, instead intensifies shame in the narcissist because it mirrors the parts of themselves they have long denied. The empath does not shame them, they simply reflect authenticity, integrity, and attunement. But the narcissist experiences this reflection as intolerable because it contrasts sharply with the defensive, fractured self they inhabit. Remorse would require the courage to face this reflection and integrate it into the self, but the mechanisms for doing so have never been built. Shame-driven collapse prevents integration and prevents learning, reinforcing the very patterns that led to betrayal in the first place. Finally, understanding the difference between remorse and shame-driven collapse also helps clarify the consequences for the empath. To the outsider, the narcissist's emotional reactions may seem like guilt, regret, or sensitivity, but in reality, these are surface expressions of unresolved trauma and defensive collapse. The empath may hope for transformation, recognition, or repair, but these expectations are often unmet because shame-driven collapse is inherently self-protective, not relationally constructive. The narcissist cannot meet the empath in true emotional space without dismantling the defenses that have been holding them together, and dismantling these defenses without guidance or support is experienced as existential threat. As a result, recovery and reconciliation are blocked, not because the narcissist is unwilling, but because they lack the capacity to tolerate and process their own inner reality. When we examine the dynamics of betrayal and the inner world of someone whose self has been fractured, it becomes clear that control often emerges as a substitute for connection. Control is not merely a behavior, it is a strategy, a learned response to vulnerability, and a mechanism by which a person attempts to manage the terrifying uncertainty of being fully seen. In a healthy relational context, connection, the ability to be known and to know another, is rooted in authenticity, trust, and mutual recognition. Connection requires emotional presence, empathy, and a willingness to tolerate discomfort without recoiling. When these capacities are missing, when the self has been fragmented by early neglect, trauma, or invalidation, the ability to connect authentically is compromised. The individual cannot safely inhabit the space of relational intimacy, so control becomes the default mode of engagement. It offers the illusion of stability, predictability, and safety, even though it comes at the cost of genuine emotional exchange. Control manifests in many subtle and overt ways. A person may manipulate conversations, situations, or perceptions to create a sense of dominance or predictability. They may use charm, coercion, or emotional withholding to orchestrate outcomes in a way that feels safe to them. These behaviors are often misinterpreted by observers as confidence, assertiveness, or decisiveness, but beneath the surface lies a deep fear, the fear of exposure, the fear of being unmasked, and the fear of being vulnerable. Connection, in contrast, requires surrender to uncertainty, the uncertainty of being fully known and accepted without pretense. For someone whose early experiences taught them that vulnerability leads to harm, control is a way to avoid that exposure. Every decision, every manipulation, every calculated interaction serves to protect the fragile self that cannot yet tolerate authenticity. When authenticity is lost, the person no longer relates from a place of genuine experience. Their inner reality, the feelings, needs, and desires that define them, is suppressed, hidden, or denied. What emerges instead is a persona designed to navigate the external world, a mask that projects competence, power, or desirability while concealing fear, shame, and unmet needs. Connection becomes threatening because it demands that the persona step aside and the true self be revealed. Empathy, attunement, and relational honesty pierce the protective layers, exposing the absence beneath the mask. Control is the response. It is an attempt to maintain the illusion, to manage perception, and to dictate the relational terrain so that the inner truth does not emerge. The paradox is that the more one seeks to control, the further one moves from authentic connection, creating a cycle that perpetuates loneliness, isolation, and relational dysfunction. In the context of a super empath, this dynamic is intensified. A super empath brings clarity, perception, and attunement that bypass ordinary defenses. They sense the underlying needs and vulnerabilities that the narcissist may not even acknowledge themselves. Their presence, though non-threatening in intention, becomes intolerable because it illuminates the gap between the constructed self and the authentic self. The narcissist reacts not with awareness or openness, but with increased efforts to control the interaction, the environment, and even the empath themselves. Control becomes a shield against the discomfort of exposure, a barrier erected to prevent emotional collapse. The empath's integrity, consistency, and emotional resonance cannot be manipulated or denied, and this inability to dominate or distort the relational field triggers defensive behaviors. Betrayal, withdrawal, and manipulation are all extensions of this attempt to maintain control when authentic connection is unavailable. Neuroscience offers insight into why this pattern is so compelling and difficult to break. Early trauma, neglect, or inconsistent caregiving shape the brain and nervous system in ways that heighten vigilance, stress reactivity, and avoidance of emotional exposure. The person learns that intimacy is dangerous and that reliance on others is fraught with risk. When connection is perceived as threatening, the body's natural response is to exert control over the environment and self in order to maintain equilibrium. This is not a conscious choice, it is an automatic, neurobiologically driven strategy for survival. Control temporarily reduces anxiety, gives a sense of predictability, and protects the fragile self from the destabilizing effects of genuine relational intimacy. However, it also prevents growth, healing, and the development of capacities for emotional regulation and authentic connection. The person becomes trapped in a feedback loop. Control protects them from exposure, but it simultaneously reinforces disconnection, isolation, and the very vulnerabilities they seek to avoid. Control also functions to manage shame, a core component of the fractured self. Shame arises when there is a recognition, conscious or unconscious, that one is flawed, inadequate, or unworthy. Connection, by highlighting these vulnerabilities, activates shame while control masks it. By orchestrating outcomes, suppressing needs, and directing interactions, the narcissist can avoid confronting the uncomfortable truths of their inner landscape. The super empath's presence threatens this balance because it holds space for authenticity without judgment, making avoidance impossible. The narcissist reacts with defensive behaviors, betrayal, emotional withdrawal, manipulation, as a means of preserving their constructed identity and avoiding the shame that accompanies exposure. Control becomes not only a strategy for interaction, but a psychological lifeline, the fragile scaffold holding together a self that is otherwise vulnerable to collapse. This dynamic explains why relationships with a narcissist can feel like an endless cycle of connection and rupture. The empath's authenticity invites genuine engagement, but the narcissist's reliance on control interrupts it. Moments of intimacy, trust, or emotional resonance are punctuated by episodes of betrayal, withdrawal, or manipulation. The fractured self cannot sustain authentic presence. It retreats behind walls of control. The more the empath seeks to maintain relational integrity, the more the narcissist feels threatened and attempts to regain equilibrium through control. The paradox is that the very strategies employed to preserve the self simultaneously prevent the healing and connection that could ultimately resolve the inner fracture. Healing, in its truest sense, is never about control, domination, or the suppression of others. True healing arises from responsibility, an acceptance of reality, an acknowledgement of one's actions, and a willingness to engage with the consequences of behavior, both internally and relationally. For someone who has betrayed a super empath, this is a particularly difficult lesson because the fractured self that drives betrayal is ill-equipped to tolerate its own reflection. The narcissist may believe that power, manipulation, or dominance can protect them from inner chaos or external accountability. They may assume that by controlling others, they can bypass the internal work that is necessary to face their unresolved trauma. Yet the reality is that control can only create an illusion of stability. It cannot foster integration, insight, or authentic repair. Responsibility, by contrast, is an inward-facing, courageous practice. It demands honesty, humility, and the willingness to meet discomfort without turning it outward, and it is precisely this practice that distinguishes those who are capable of genuine recovery from those who are doomed to repetition. Responsibility begins with awareness. To take responsibility is to acknowledge not only the actions that caused harm, but also the underlying patterns, beliefs, and unmet needs that contributed to those actions. For the narcissist, this requires looking squarely at a fractured self that has been carefully hidden behind layers of defense, projection, and rationalization. It is not enough to say, "I was wrong," or to apologize superficially. True responsibility involves understanding why the betrayal occurred, how it relates to unhealed wounds, and what needs were unmet that led to destructive behavior. It involves recognizing the interconnectedness of inner experience and outward action, and embracing the discomfort that arises from seeing oneself clearly. For someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding such introspection, the process can feel threatening, overwhelming, and destabilizing. The tendency is to retreat into control strategies, domination over others, manipulation of perception, or rationalization of actions, to avoid confronting the inner chaos that responsibility exposes. Domination, on the other hand, is inherently self-protective. It seeks to assert power over others as a substitute for internal coherence. In the context of betrayal, domination may manifest as coercion, emotional withdrawal, gaslighting, or manipulation, all aimed at preserving a sense of superiority or control. The narcissist convinces themselves that by managing external realities, they can maintain internal stability, yet this approach is fundamentally flawed. Control cannot heal unmet childhood needs, cannot repair the nervous system's conditioned responses to trauma, and cannot cultivate insight or emotional integration. In fact, domination perpetuates the very fractures it seeks to protect, because it relies on external validation, fear, and avoidance rather than internal work. Every act of control pushes the narcissist further from authentic presence and deep connection, reinforcing the cycle of betrayal, shame, and isolation. Responsibility, by contrast, is relational as well as internal. When a super empath has been betrayed, the path to reconciliation, if it is even possible, cannot be forged through domination. The empath cannot be coerced into connection, cannot be manipulated into forgiveness, and cannot be used as a tool to soothe the narcissist's discomfort. Responsibility involves acknowledging the harm done, expressing genuine remorse, and committing to self-reflective growth without expecting immediate repair or absolution from the other. It requires humility, patience, and a willingness to tolerate the consequences of actions without trying to control outcomes. The difference is stark. Domination is an external assertion of power that masks internal fear. Responsibility is an internal acceptance of truth that fosters genuine transformation. Neurobiologically, responsibility engages circuits that domination bypasses. Facing one's own behavior, understanding its roots, and holding oneself accountable activate prefrontal regions of the brain involved in reflection, planning, and ethical reasoning. These regions are often underdeveloped in someone whose early environment prioritized survival over authenticity. Domination, in contrast, relies heavily on reactive, limbic-driven patterns, fight, flight, or freeze responses that are tuned to immediate survival rather than long-term growth. This explains why cycles of betrayal are so difficult to interrupt. The strategies that dominated early survival may persist into adulthood, even when they are no longer adaptive, and the capacity for responsibility remains undeveloped. True healing requires the hard work of cultivating those neglected capacities, and doing so in the presence of discomfort, shame, and relational challenge. Another critical aspect of responsibility is the acknowledgement of interdependence. The narcissist often operates under the illusion of self-sufficiency, that they alone are responsible for their stability, their emotions, and their fate. But relational life is inherently interdependent. Our actions ripple outward, and the pain caused to others is not incidental. It is part of the relational fabric that sustains both self and community. Responsibility means recognizing the relational consequences of one's choices, seeing the harm as real and significant, and engaging with it ethically. Domination denies this interdependence. It treats others as instruments, obstacles, or mirrors to be managed rather than as autonomous beings whose boundaries and emotions matter. Responsibility, by embracing interdependence, opens the door to insight, empathy, and the possibility of relational repair, even if the empath ultimately chooses to disengage. Finally, responsibility demands sustained courage. It is not a one-time acknowledgement, but a lifelong commitment to observing, learning, and responding differently. It requires the capacity to tolerate shame, face internal fractures, and resist the seductive but ultimately destructive lure of domination. Without this courage, recovery is impossible. The fractured self will continue to rely on control strategies, betrayals, and manipulations as a way to navigate life. With responsibility, however, there is the possibility, though not the guarantee, of integration, self-awareness, and authentic engagement with others. Healing is not granted by external validation or power over others. It is achieved by facing oneself, taking ownership of actions, and cultivating the internal structures that were never nurtured in childhood.